The blindfold smelled of damp linen and old smoke. It sat tight across Blanche's eyes, pressing the bridge of her nose, turning the world into heat and darkness. Beneath it, her lashes fluttered uselessly. She tried to slow her breathing, to stop her lungs from betraying her nerves with shallow, excited gulps. The car moved in short, careful bursts. A stop. A turn. Then another stretch of uneven road that made the suspension complain. Every jolt traveled through Blanche's body and settled in her stomach like a warning. Remember what they taught you, she told herself. Do not ask. Do not guess. Do not panic. But this was her first mission. Her first real one outside pamphlets, outside whispered messages passed between hands in a bakery line. No more safe errands disguised as errands. Tonight she had been collected like a parcel, her name spoken once, her instructions reduced to one sentence. Put this on. Say nothing. She had obeyed. Of course she had. Obedience was not cowardice, it was survival. Yet in the darkness her mind kept producing images, each more dangerous than the last: German boots on a stairwell, a pistol sliding into her ribs, the cold light of an interrogation room. She swallowed hard, tasting the metallic edge of fear. Across from her sat at least one other person. She could hear him breathing, slow, controlled, older. When the car slowed, he shifted slightly, as if checking the door or the road. He did not speak to her. Silence, Blanche knew, was also a kind of protection. Still, her body refused to settle. Underneath the fear was something else, sharp, bright, almost shameful in its intensity: exhilaration. She had wanted this. She had asked for it, again and again, until they finally decided she was ready. She could not pretend she was innocent of her own ambition. France had been occupied for too long. Her youth had been stolen in small daily humiliations, ration cards, whispered curfews, the constant awareness of uniforms. She wanted to strike back. She wanted to matter. The car turned again. The road became rougher. Gravel snapped under the tires. The air changed. Even through the blindfold she felt it. Less city, more open space, damp earth and cold leaves. They stopped. A door opened. Night air poured in, colder than Blanche expected. She shivered as someone took her by the elbow and guided her out. Her shoes met uneven ground. Gravel. Mud. The scent of wet stone. Someone knocked a coded rhythm on wood. A pause. Then another rhythm answered from inside. The door opened with a slow creak. Blanche was led forward. Inside, the air was still and closed, like a house that had not been lived in for a long time but had never quite been emptied. The smell was not rot or ruin, more like old furniture and linen left too long in a dark room. Dust, yes, but not decay. Her guide kept his grip firm but not cruel as they crossed a hallway. Blanche could hear the faint echo of their steps on polished wood. The walls were papered. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, silent and dignified. A sideboard held porcelain that had never been packed away. It was furnished, strangely, almost eerily so. As if the occupants had stepped out one day and never returned. They climbed a short staircase. Blanche felt the banister under her gloved fingertips, smooth, carved. Even blindfolded she could picture the house. Bourgeois, comfortable, the kind of place a family might once have filled with summer voices and Sunday dinners. Now it belonged to shadows and whispers. They stopped at a closed door. Stay still, a voice murmured near Blanche's ear, female, brisk, confident. Hands reached behind Blanche's head and untied the blindfold. The cloth slid away, and lamplight hurt her eyes like a blow. She blinked hard, fighting tears brought on by brightness rather than emotion. She was standing in a bedroom. A proper one. A large bed dominated the room, the coverlet pulled back, pillows stacked. A wardrobe stood against one wall, and a dressing table with a mirror caught the lamplight in dull gold. Heavy curtains sealed the windows, the fabric thick enough to smother any telltale glow from outside. And in the bed lay a man who looked carved from pain. Not on a floor pallet, not in some desperate improvised hiding place. In a bed, as though the house itself had offered him the last dignity it could afford. His chest was wrapped in broad bandages, white layers stained in one place by a dark bloom that made Blanche's stomach tighten. One leg was braced and elevated, clearly broken. His face was pale beneath bruising, his mouth slightly open as he breathed. His hair, lighter than most Frenchmen's, lay damp against his forehead. His eyes were closed. He looked young. Too young to be lying still like that. Blanche took a step forward before she could stop herself. "What?" she began. Her voice sounded too loud in the enclosed room, too alive for the fragile stillness around that bed. The woman beside her, older, hair pinned tight, expression hardened by necessity, caught her arm. "Quiet." Blanche swallowed, throat dry. "Who is he?" she whispered, unable to keep the tremor from the question. The woman's gaze flicked to Blanche's face, measuring her. "British," she said simply. "RAF." His aircraft was hit. He jumped. Blanche stared at the injured man. Suddenly he was not merely a man. He was a symbol of something enormous and dangerous: allies, hope, retaliation. A life the Germans would kill to reclaim, if only to make an example of whoever had helped him. "And me," Blanche managed. "Why am I here?" The woman's mouth tightened, as if she disliked explanations but understood Blanche deserved one. "Because you can keep your head. Because you can follow instructions." She paused, then added with blunt finality, "Because you're young enough to pass as a nurse if someone sees you going in and out." Blanche's hands went cold. "I'm not a nurse." "You will be," the woman replied. She stepped aside, forcing Blanche to face what lay on the bed. "This is your first mission, Blanche." The words landed like a verdict. "To care for him," the woman continued. "Feed him. Change the dressings. Keep him alive." Blanche stared at the man in the bed and felt the first sharp edge of disappointment cut through her adrenaline. This was it. Her first mission, hidden in a furnished but abandoned cottage, miles from anywhere, reduced to silence and bandages. She had imagined movement, danger, codes whispered in cafes, the thrill of sabotage. Not watching an unknown man breathe in pain while the war carried on elsewhere. She turned to the woman in charge, trying to keep her voice steady. "Why me?" The answer came without hesitation. "Because you're the only local we trust who's fluent in English. If he wakes, he needs to understand. And you need to understand him." Blanche swallowed. She felt suddenly exposed, as if her education, once a private advantage, had become a weapon the resistance intended to use. She hesitated, then asked, quieter, "What's his name?" The woman reached into her pocket and placed 2 dull metal plates into Blanche's palm. Identification tags. The cold weight of them startled her. Blanche bent closer, reading the stamped letters under the lamp. Andrew. Nothing else she could hold on to. Just a name. She approached the bed. The wounded man stirred, eyelids lifting with effort. His eyes met hers, blue-gray, fever-dulled, full of suffering and stubborn life. For a moment Blanche forgot the boredom, the isolation, even the fear. She closed her fingers around the tags as if sealing a vow. "All right," she whispered. "I'll do it." Picardy, in the late autumn of 1940, was a country of damp fields and exhausted color, hedgerows stripped bare, roads softened into mud, and skies that seemed permanently laden with rain. The occupation had settled over northern France with the same bleak certainty as the season itself, quiet, heavy, unavoidable. Blanche belonged to the village in the only way anyone could belong now. By appearing ordinary. To most, she was simply the café girl, Quick hands, a calm smile, an apron that smelled of coffee grounds and soap. But she had learned early that appearances were not truth. They were armor. Her father had been American, a former soldier of the Great War who stayed in France after the armistice. Her mother, young and French, had married him despite local disapproval. Blanche grew up bilingual, with two histories in her blood, never entirely one thing or the other. In peacetime, it made her noticeable. In war, it made her useful. Her parents' deaths came suddenly, in a bus accident when she was still a teenager. Grief had not been a luxury she could afford for long. She worked, endured, and matured too fast, developing a kind of courage that was practical rather than theatrical, though she had kept the ability to laugh when she chose to. Determined, but not brittle. That combination made her a natural choice when the Germans invaded. Now, holding cold identification tags in her palm, Blanche listened as her contact gave instructions in a low voice. Which grocer could be trusted, which widow kept flour hidden, which hours were safest to move through the village without attracting attention. Blanche memorized everything without writing it down. When the door finally closed behind them, the cottage fell silent again except for the injured pilot's shallow breathing. She moved at once, exploring the house like someone preparing a position. Doors, shutters, cupboards, water, linen, kettle, back exit. She mapped every room in her mind until the cottage felt less like a trap and more like a post. At dawn, the man in the bed stirred. Andrew's eyelids lifted with effort. Pain sharpened his gaze as he saw her. His voice, when it came, was rough, urgent, unmistakably English. "Where am I?" Blanche stepped closer, forcing calm into her posture. "You're safe," she said softly. "My name is Blanche." He swallowed, blinking hard. "Andrew," he murmured, as if claiming himself again. And in that brief exchange, the mission stopped being an abstraction. It became real. His first weeks were ruled by silence. Not the kind Blanche had known in the café when the Germans walked in and every voice died at once, leaving only the scrape of boots and the clink of cups. This was a different silence, domestic, enclosed, intimate in its repetition. The cottage seemed to inhale and exhale around them, holding their secret the way thick curtains held back lamplight. Outside, Picardy continued to move through autumn into winter. Rain came often. Wind worried the shutters. Now and then a distant vehicle passed on the road, and Blanche would freeze mid-motion with a spoon in her hand, listening until the sound faded. The fear never left. It simply learned how to live alongside routine. Andrew slept through most of those early days. When he woke, it was in fragments, eyes opening, glassy and disoriented, then closing again as pain tugged him under. The bandages around his chest had to be changed with slow care. His broken leg remained braced and elevated, the bone knitting itself together with a patience that felt almost mocking in wartime. Blanche learned the rhythm of his breathing the way she learned the rhythm of baking bread. Watch, wait, adjust, do not rush. At first, he spoke very little. His voice came out rough and hoarse, threaded with fever. Sometimes he mistook her for someone else, called a name she did not recognize, or pleaded in half-formed sentences that sounded like childhood memories. Blanche sat by the bed and listened, her hand steady even when her heart wasn't. She answered softly in English when she could, in French when she couldn't, and when nothing made sense she simply stayed where he could see her when he woke. Tea was strange, how quickly a stranger's fragility could become familiar. When his fever finally broke quietly, without drama, it felt like a victory. Andrew's eyes opened one morning and remained open. He looked around the bedroom slowly, as though the cottage were a puzzle he intended to solve, then turned his gaze to Blanche. He held it. This time there was no delirium in his face. Only exhaustion, pain, and a sharp awareness that cut through both. "You're real," he rasped. Blanche swallowed. "Yes." He stared at her for a long moment, then shut his eyes briefly as if gathering strength. Where am I? The question landed differently now. It was no longer the raw demand of an injured man. It was the beginning of understanding, and with it, danger. Blanche sat back in the chair by the bed. Her posture remained calm, but her spine was rigid with vigilance. You're hidden, she said. In Picardy. You fell near here. People brought you. The resistance. Andrew's brow tightened. Resistance. Yes. He swallowed hard. The movement pulled at his chest wound. He winced, then forced himself to keep his composure. And you? My name is Blanche, she said again, because names were often the first thread that made a person feel human. Blanche, he repeated, slower. Testing the sound. Are you French? Yes. But you speak English. I have to, she replied. She hesitated, then offered a fragment of truth that was safe enough. My father was American. Andrew's eyes widened slightly, surprise, recognition, perhaps a piece of his own world snapping into place. American, he murmured. Lucky man. Blanche didn't answer. Luck had not kept her parents alive. Andrew shifted, trying to sit up. Blanche rose instantly, stepping forward with practiced authority. No. You mustn't. His gaze flicked to her hands, then back to her face. He looked unused to being instructed, yet too weak to argue. He sank back into the pillows, jaw clenched with frustration. How long? He asked. Blanche considered. A while, she said truthfully. Longer than you want. Andrew exhaled, staring at the ceiling. For a moment he looked very young enough that Blanche could imagine him in a different life, whole and reckless, laughing at a table full of friends. Then his eyes returned to her, sharper now. Why are you here? The question carried suspicion, but also something else. Gratitude he didn't yet know how to express. Blanche kept her voice steady. Because I was chosen. I'm the only local member fluent in English. If you wake, you need someone to understand you. Andrew's mouth twitched slightly. So I'm your assignment. Blanche could have bristled at the phrasing. Instead she nodded. At first. Something passed in Andrew's eyes, interest, perhaps, at her bluntness. He was used to women smoothing their words. Blanche did not smooth anything. Thank you, he said finally, as if the sentence cost him. Blanche lowered her gaze, uncomfortable with thanks. She had done many small illegal things since the occupation began. Caring for him was simply the most intimate. You're welcome, she murmured. Then, because she needed to anchor them both in reality, you must stay quiet. You cannot leave. If you are discovered, you will be shot. And so will I. Andrew's face changed. The war entered the room with that sentence. Not as an abstract idea, but as a blade. Understood, he said quietly. After that, their days began. Winter settled in like a second occupation. The cottage grew colder by the week. Blanche rationed wood and coal with the same careful discipline she rationed hope, measured, controlled, never wasted. She learned how to stretch what they had without making the house look lived in. Curtains stayed drawn at night. The lamp was used sparingly. Meals were simple, repetitive, quietly nourishing. When she went into the village, she became the café girl again. Hair neatly pinned, apron folded under her coat, expression mild and forgettable. She carried a basket like any other young woman running errands for an aunt or a widowed neighbor. She never rushed. Never looked over her shoulder. Never behaved like someone who had something to hide. The resistance had given her rules, which grocer might slip her extra flour without questions, which street to avoid on certain mornings, which doorways to use if she had to wait out a patrol. Blanche obeyed them with precision. Still, each journey carried dread. Not the sharp fear of a gun pointed at her, but the slow, exhausting terror of being observed. The fear of a slip too small to notice until it was too late, the wrong glance, the wrong pause, the wrong name overheard. Some days she returned with only bread and potatoes. Other days she brought news. 2 German trucks in the square, she said once, shrugging off her damp coat as if it meant nothing. They're searching houses near the church. Andrew, propped against pillows, went still. Looking for what? Blanche tightened her scarf, hands steady. Men. Radios. Resistance. She spoke with a forced casualness, as though the words were not heavy. But she saw Andrew's jaw tighten, saw the helpless anger wake behind his eyes. After she bolted the cottage door, relief washed through her so hard it almost made her weak. She stood with her back to the wood for a moment, eyes shut, breathing as if she had been underwater. Andrew watched her more and more in those moments. At first he said nothing. Then one afternoon, when she came in with flour dust clinging to her sleeves and rain darkening her hairline, he spoke quietly, too carefully. "They're making you do all of it." Blanche glanced up. "What?" "The risks," Andrew said. "The errands. The lying. Every time you go out there." He stopped, swallowing, his voice rough with frustration. "If they catch you, it won't matter that you're only carrying bread. It won't matter that you look harmless." Blanche's eyes held his. She understood too well. She had understood since the first night she was brought to the cottage blindfolded. Andrew exhaled sharply. "I should be the one helping you," he said. "Not lying in here like dead weight." Blanche moved to the table, placing the flour down with more force than necessary. "You're not dead weight." Andrew gave a short, bitter laugh. "What am I, then?" Blanche stepped closer, lowering her voice instinctively. "You're alive," she said. "That's what you are. And that's the point." Andrew stared at her, something raw in his expression. "I hate it," he admitted. "Watching you walk into danger while I can't even stand." Blanche's shoulders lifted in a restrained shrug. "I do what I have to do." "That's your answer for everything," Andrew said. "Yes," Blanche replied, without apology. Then, softer, "because it's the only answer that works." For a moment the cottage seemed to tighten around them, the cold, the silence, the war pressing close beyond the shutters. Andrew looked away first. When he spoke again his voice had changed, quieter, humbled. "I never imagined courage could look like a basket of bread," he said. Blanche's mouth twitched faintly. "Then you imagined it wrong." Andrew's gaze returned to her. "You're risking your life for me." Blanche held his eyes. "Not just for you." As his strength improved, Andrew began to move through the cottage in small stages. First he learned to sit up for longer periods. Then to shift himself to the edge of the bed without going grey with pain. Blanche helped him wash with a basin of warm water, her movements brisk and professional, refusing to allow either of them embarrassment. She had nursed people before, her mother in sickness, neighbors after accidents, the occasional drunk in the café who had fallen badly. Bodies were bodies. Pain made them equal. Yet even so, there were moments when the intimacy caught her unaware. Andrew's hands were strong despite injury, his wrists lean, his forearms marked faintly with bruises from the crash. When she changed the bandages on his chest, she could not help noticing the breadth beneath them. He was not a boy. He was a man who had once been in effortless possession of his own physicality. Sometimes his breath would hitch when she touched him. Sometimes hers would too, though she pretended otherwise. Their first real laughter came unexpectedly, like sunlight through cloud. Andrew had been watching her knead dough at the kitchen table, slow, stubborn work, flour dusting her hairline. He said, half mocking, "I never imagined the resistance would defeat Germany with bread." Blanche glanced at him. And I never imagined the RAF would be defeated by my chair. Andrew looked offended. This chair is a weapon, he declared. Designed by the enemy. Blanche snorted, then laughed, sudden and sharp. She clapped a hand over her mouth instinctively, as if laughter were dangerous. In occupied France, it sometimes was. But Andrew smiled. It transformed him. His face softened, eyes warming, the rigid lines of pain easing for a heartbeat. I like that sound, he said quietly. Blanche's cheeks warmed. She turned back to the dough, pretending indifference. It's only laughter. No, Andrew replied. It's proof you still exist. The words were too intimate. Blanche's hands stilled briefly, flour sticking to her fingers. She felt, uncomfortably, as though Andrew had seen through the armor she wore so easily in the village. She changed the subject, voice brisk. Eat when it's ready. Andrew didn't push. He simply watched her, his gaze thoughtful, as if storing details he might need later. As weeks turned into months, their isolation became its own strange world. It was not peaceful, not truly. War hovered at the edges. German patrols, ration shortages, the constant hum of fear. Yet within the cottage there was a bubble of ordinary life. Two people bound by necessity, waiting for healing. It created habits. Habits created intimacy. Andrew began to tell her pieces of himself, almost by accident. It started one evening when wind rattled the shutters and the lamp flame shook. Blanche was darning socks by the fire, an old habit that soothed her nerves, while Andrew sat with his leg elevated, a book open on his lap. You were born here? He asked suddenly. In a different village, Blanche said. Not far. Andrew nodded. I've never been to France before the war. You don't say, Blanche replied dryly. He smiled faintly, then grew quieter. I grew up in Surrey, he said. A house too big. Too many rooms. Too many people who smiled without meaning it. Blanche glanced up. Andrew's face had changed. He wasn't boasting. He wasn't performing. He sounded unexpectedly tired. My family, he continued, is what you'd call high society. My father likes to believe it means something. And does it? Blanche asked. Andrew's mouth twisted. It means dinners. Expectations. A name that must be polished and displayed like silver. Blanche returned to her sewing, listening. I was clever at school, Andrew admitted. Not clever enough to enjoy it. Clever enough to get into trouble. Trouble? Blanche echoed. Andrew's eyes flicked to hers. Parties. Gambling. Women I shouldn't have touched. Friends I shouldn't have trusted. He shrugged slightly. My father called it youthful indulgence. My mother called it a phase. Blanche frowned. And you? Andrew stared at the fire. I called it living. There was such emptiness in the phrase that Blanche felt a sharp pang of pity. She had imagined an RAF pilot as a man of purpose, forged by discipline and duty. Instead, Andrew sounded like someone who had been drifting until the war forced the world to make demands of him. So why join? She asked. Andrew's jaw tightened. Because I had no other direction. And because my father, he stopped, then exhaled. My father wanted something to brag about. Blanche's needle paused. You flew planes so he could brag. Andrew's eyes sharpened, offended. No. Not only. At first perhaps. He hesitated, then said more quietly, but once it began. Once I saw what we were really fighting, it stopped being about him. He looked up at her. His gaze held intensity now. I wanted to be worth something, he said. Blanche's throat tightened. The sentence hit her harder than she expected. It echoed too closely to her own hunger when she joined the resistance, her need to matter, to strike back, to prove that occupation had not stolen her entire youth. You are worth something, Blanche said. Andrew blinked, as if unused to being spoken to that way. Blanche's voice softened but remained firm. Even lying there, Andrew. You are. For a moment neither spoke. The lamp hissed. The wind pressed against the cottage. Then Andrew lowered his gaze and said quietly, almost ashamed, "Thank you." Spring arrived slowly, as if the world no longer trusted itself to soften. The fields outside the cottage began to green in thin strokes. Hedgerows showed the first tender leaves. Even the light changed, less grey, less tight-lipped, lingering longer at the windows before surrendering to evening. Blanche opened them in cautious increments, letting air inside like a fragile permission. The scent of damp earth and new growth threaded through the rooms and settled into fabric, into hair, into the very notion of time. Andrew improved with the season. Not dramatically. Not as if healing had been waiting for the sun like a cue. But the change was undeniable. His fever was long gone, the bruises had faded into faint stains on his skin, the wound at his chest no longer demanded constant attention. He could sit by the kitchen table now, leg elevated, reading when the pain allowed and watching Blanche move through the house with the same quiet efficiency she used in the café. He had begun using crutches. The first time he stood properly, his face went white, sweat forming instantly at his temples, jaw clenched so hard Blanche thought his teeth might crack. She stepped forward without thinking, hands hovering, ready to catch him. Andrew's gaze snapped to her. "I don't need." "Yes, you do," Blanche cut in. Her voice was firm, almost severe. Andrew swayed slightly. His pride, for once, was forced to bow to reality. He allowed her to steady his elbow, his arm trembling with strain. Blanche could feel how much he hated this weakness, not merely the pain, but the indignity of dependence. "You're rushing," she scolded. Andrew's laugh came out harsh. "You say that like you've ever been capable of waiting." Blanche's eyebrows lifted. "You've learned to speak like a Frenchman." "I've learned from the best," Andrew muttered. But later, when he sat again and the color returned to his face, Blanche noticed how his eyes followed her hands as she poured water. How his attention stayed on her, lingering on details, hair escaping its pins, the line of her neck above her collar, the way her sleeves rode up when she lifted the pot from the fire. It was no longer merely gratitude. It had not been for some time. The war remained at the edges of their days like a blade held just out of sight. Blanche still went into the village. Still counted coins carefully. Still kept her expression mild and forgettable, the café girl who belonged to nobody and therefore raised no suspicions. She brought back bread, potatoes, soap when she could. Sometimes eggs, sometimes a rare piece of meat, as if the cottage might pretend at normal life for an hour. But increasingly she returned with news. Small at first. A new patrol schedule. A German officer billeted in a nearby farmhouse. A change in curfew. Then one afternoon she came back pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She closed the door behind her and bolted it with more force than necessary. Andrew, seated by the table, looked up immediately. His eyes narrowed. What happened? Blanche shook her head, already moving toward the sink as if she could wash the tremor out of her hands. Nothing. Andrew's voice sharpened. Blanche. Her name, spoken like that, made her stop. She stood with her back to him for a moment, shoulders rigid. Then she exhaled, slow, controlled, the breath of someone who had learned to swallow fear. There were arrests, she said quietly. Andrew's face changed. In the village. In Amiens, Blanche replied. But names travel. They always do. Andrew's hands curled into fists. Resistance. Yes. How many? Blanche hesitated. The pause was too long. Andrew noticed. How many? I don't know, she said, too quickly. Enough. The lamp hissed softly. Outside, a bird called bright, careless, insulting in its freedom. Andrew's voice dropped into something rougher. And you still went out there today. I had to, Blanche said. You didn't have to, Andrew snapped. You could have stayed here. You could have. Could have what? Blanche turned sharply, the composure cracking. Let us starve. Let you lie here without clean bandages. Let the house run out of wood so the cold finishes what the Germans started. Andrew's jaw clenched. Blanche's voice shook now, furious with the injustice of it. I can't save everyone. I can barely save you. The words landed and stayed. Andrew stared at her as if he had never truly seen the weight she carried until this moment. His anger didn't vanish, but it shifted shape, turning inward, becoming guilt, frustration, helpless admiration. He rose from his chair on his crutches with abrupt determination. Blanche immediately stepped forward. Don't. But Andrew moved anyway, crossing the room in awkward, stubborn progress. Each step was effort, each breath tight with pain, but he didn't stop until he stood in front of her, too close, breathing hard. Blanche froze, caught between scolding and fear. Andrew looked down at her with an intensity that unsettled her. You talk like you don't matter, he said hoarsely. Like you're expendable. Blanche's eyes flashed. And you talk like you know anything about France. Andrew's mouth twitched, not into humor, but into something tender and dangerous. I know this, he said. Blanche lifted her chin. What? Andrew leaned closer, lowering his voice as if the cottage itself might overhear. You're not just doing what you must, he murmured. You're choosing it. Over and over. And pretending it costs you nothing. Blanche's breath caught. She hated that he could see it. She hated more that he was right. I was assigned to you, she whispered, as if that could reduce the feeling growing in her chest to something manageable. Andrew's eyes didn't move. Liar. The word was soft, almost affectionate. Blanche's lips parted. She should have stepped back. Instead her hand rose slowly and caught the edge of his sleeve, fingers curling there, as if anchoring him would anchor her too. Andrew swallowed. His gaze flicked to her mouth. Then back to her eyes, as if asking permission and daring her to refuse. Blanche didn't refuse. She closed the final distance herself, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was immediate in its truth. Months of isolation, dependence, fear, intimacy disguised as duty. Andrew's mouth was warm, a little rough, and his breath trembled as if he had been holding himself back for longer than she could imagine. His hand lifted, careful, reverent, and touched her cheek. Blanche felt her entire body respond, heat rushing through her as if she had been cold for years. When they separated, both were breathing hard. Andrew's forehead rested briefly against hers. His eyes were half closed. Blanche, he whispered, as if her name were the only safe thing left in the world. Blanche's voice came out thin. You're injured. Andrew gave a quiet, bitter laugh. I'm alive. And that, said with such raw honesty, undid her. That night, the cottage seemed smaller. The shutters were closed, the door bolted, the lamp turned low. Blanche moved through her tasks with hands that trembled now and then, checking the windows, laying out fresh linen, placing the water basin near the bedroom. Andrew watched her from the bed, his expression unreadable but intent, as though memorizing the sight of her in lamplight. Blanche approached him with the familiar bandages. Andrew's gaze dropped to her hands. You don't have to, he murmured. Blanche swallowed. Yes, she said, quiet. I do. Her fingers moved over the knots, loosening fabric. She worked slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. Everything she touched now carried a different meaning. The bandage wasn't just medical cloth. It was the barrier between duty and desire. When the last layer eased away, she saw the healing skin beneath, still tender, still marked. Andrew watched her face, not her hands, as if her expression mattered more than pain. Blanche reached for clean linen, her movements gentle. Andrew caught her wrist lightly, not stopping her, only holding. Blanche looked up. His eyes were dark in the lamplight, full of the same restrained hunger she had seen in herself reflected back. He didn't pull her. He didn't demand. He simply waited. That patience, quiet, respectful, made Blanche's throat tighten. She leaned down and kissed him again. This time Andrew responded immediately, his hand sliding into her hair, drawing her closer with a tenderness that felt almost unbearable. Blanche climbed carefully onto the bed beside him, mindful of his leg, of his healing chest, of every bruise that still held memory of the crash. Andrew's hands moved over her with a reverence that did not feel hesitant, only deliberate, as if he wanted to learn her slowly, properly, to make the moment real in a world that constantly tried to make everything unreal. Blanche pressed her face to his neck, breathing him in. He smelled of soap, linen, and something faintly metallic. The trace of injury that still lingered. She kissed the skin beneath his jaw, and felt him shudder. Outside, the wind shifted. Inside, their clothes fell away in quiet pieces, not hurried, not clumsy, only human. Blanche felt the warmth of his body against hers and understood, with sudden clarity, that she had been starved not only of safety but of touch that meant something. Andrew held her as if he had been waiting for her his entire life. Their lovemaking was slow, careful, intense. Not born of lust alone, but of the long months when every feeling had been forced to remain silent. Blanche learned the sound Andrew made when he could no longer hold himself perfectly still. Andrew learned the way Blanche's breath changed when she stopped trying to be brave. When it was over, they lay tangled beneath the sheet, listening to each other's breathing. Andrew's arm remained around her waist, protective without possession. Blanche rested her head on his shoulder, eyes open in the dimness, as if afraid that sleep might steal the moment away. After a long silence, Andrew whispered, "You shouldn't have to do this alone." Blanche's voice was soft, hoarse with emotion and exhaustion. "I'm not alone anymore." Andrew tightened his hold, his lips brushing her hair. In the quiet cottage, hidden from the war for one more night, Blanche finally allowed herself to believe that survival could contain more than fear. It could contain love. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous defiance of all. Andrew's recovery accelerated with spring. His crutches became less of a prison and more a tool. His breathing deepened. He could stand at the window and watch Blanche return from the village without looking as though he might collapse. He began to help in small ways, carrying light loads, chopping vegetables sitting at the table, even washing dishes one-handed while Blanche watched him like a hawk and scolded him for pretending he was healed. "You want to fall and die in my kitchen?" she asked once, exasperated. Andrew smiled faintly. "I want to be useful." His voice had changed. There was less restlessness in it, less forced humor. Blanche realized, with a quiet shock, that the months hidden in this cottage had done something the war had not. They had made him real to himself. And the romance between them grew the way everything grew in wartime, intensely, without ceremony. It lived in the smallest gestures. The way Andrew waited for her to finish speaking before he answered, as if her words deserved reverence. The way Blanche began to sit nearer to him in the evenings, shoulder to shoulder by the fire, their knees touching without either pretending it was accidental. The way he looked at her mouth when she spoke English, as though he could not decide whether he wanted to kiss her or thank her. They did not speak of the future. They did not name what they were building. Naming it would have made it vulnerable. Then one afternoon, the knock came. It was coded 3 short taps, a pause, then 2. Blanche's entire body tightened. She crossed the room fast, her eyes flicking to Andrew as if to confirm he was still hidden, still safe. Andrew, instantly alert, reached for the cane he used now in place of one crutch. Blanche opened the door only a fraction. A man stood in the doorway, rein on his coat, hat pulled low. He looked ordinary in the way resistance men tried to look ordinary. Capable of disappearing into any crowd. His gaze was sharp, assessing, briefly scanning behind Blanche into the house. "Blanche," he said quietly. "We need to see him." Blanche hesitated only a second, then stepped aside. The man entered without removing his coat. He smelled of wet tobacco and cold roads. He nodded once at Andrew, then approached him with the detached focus of someone trained to measure men as assets. Andrew straightened in his chair, expression careful. "Stand," the resistance man instructed. Andrew's eyes hardened. "I'm not a horse." The man didn't react. "Stand." Blanche held her breath. Andrew forced himself up. He did it steadily, impressive, controlled, but Blanche saw the faint tremor in his thigh, the way pain still lived in his body like an enemy. The resistance man watched the movement the way a tailor watches fit. Then he reached, without asking, toward the bandaged area of Andrew's chest, checking the healing with practiced hands. Andrew flinched. His jaw clenched. Blanche's fingers curled into fists. Finally the man stepped back. "Good," he said. "Good enough." Andrew's eyes narrowed. "For what?" The man looked at Blanche now. "For evacuation." The word seemed to make the cottage tilt. Blanche's mouth went dry. "Already?" "You've done well," the man said. There was no warmth in it. Only acknowledgement. He can walk. He can travel. He's alive. That's all we needed. Andrew stared at him, silent. "There's a boat," the man continued. "Fishing boat. 2 nights from now. He'll be taken out through the marsh track. Then across. England." Blanche heard her own heartbeat. It sounded too loud. The man glanced between them, noticing, at last, something in the air he had not expected. A closeness. A shared life. His expression tightened into something like irritation. "This is war," he said curtly, as if cutting a thread. "Don't make it sentimental." Then he turned to Blanche. "Burn anything with his name. Any English papers. Clean the bed. No trace. Understood?" Blanche nodded numbly. The man left as quickly as he had arrived. The coded knock became a memory. The cottage door shut again. But the world did not return to what it was. Because now they both understood, the bubble had an end. Andrew remained standing for a moment after the man was gone. Then he sat down slowly, as if his strength had drained through the floorboards. Blanche watched him, unable to move. His face looked different, older, suddenly stripped of its slow peace. "So that's it," he said quietly. Blanche swallowed. "You'll go home." Andrew gave a short laugh that held no humor at all. "Home." He stared at the fire without seeing it. "I don't think I even know what that means anymore." Blanche crossed the room and knelt beside him, hands finding his automatically. "We knew this day would come," she whispered. Andrew's gaze snapped to her. The intensity in it startled her. "Did we?" he asked. "Or did we pretend it wouldn't?" Blanche had no answer. That night, they moved around each other as if the cottage had become unfamiliar. Blanche cooked without tasting. Andrew ate without appetite. When Blanche washed dishes, her hands shook until she had to grip the edge of the sink to steady herself. Later, when they went to the bedroom, there were no careful pauses, no slow restraint. There was hunger. Not only for bodies, but for time. Andrew kissed her with desperation that made Blanche's breath catch. His hands found her as if he feared she might vanish the moment he let go. Blanche clung to him equally hard, tears burning behind her eyes, refusing to fall because if she cried she might never stop. Their love that night was fierce, searching, almost painful in its tenderness. They held each other as if trying to memorize skin, as if touch could become proof that this had been real. Blanche felt Andrew tremble against her. Not from weakness, but from the knowledge that morning would bring departure. Afterwards they lay tangled in the sheets, breathing in the dark. Andrew's voice, when it came, sounded raw. "Come with me." Blanche went still. He shifted carefully, propping himself slightly so he could see her face. Even in darkness, she could feel his eyes on her. "I mean it," he said. "Come to England. With me." Blanche's throat tightened. "Andrew." "No," he interrupted softly. "Listen. I had my whole life before this. Parties. Drink. People who laughed too loudly and meant nothing." He swallowed. "I thought the war would give me purpose. A cause. Honor. Something my family could admire." Blanche didn't move. Andrew's hand found her cheek. "But these months with you," his voice broke slightly. He steadied it. "They were the only months that ever felt real. Blanche, you are the only thing that made me feel like a man worth becoming." Blanche's eyes burned. "You're not my mission," he whispered. "You're my purpose. Not the war." The words hit her like a wound. Blanche sat up abruptly, pulling the sheet tighter around herself as if armor. "No," she said, firm, immediate. "I won't." Andrew stared at her. Blanche forced herself to speak clearly, so he would understand it was not fear. "Not because I'm afraid," she said, "but because it would be cowardice. To abandon my country while it's occupied. To leave the resistance. To leave the people who risk everything, every day." Andrew's face tightened. "So you'll stay and die here?" Blanche's eyes flashed. "If I must." Andrew looked away, jaw clenched so hard she could hear his teeth shift. For a moment, Blanche thought the argument would destroy what they had built. Then Andrew spoke again, quiet, defeated. "I can't ask you to betray yourself," he admitted. "But I also can't pretend this doesn't tear me apart." Blanche lay back down slowly. She didn't move toward him. Not yet. Because the truth was, she didn't know if she could survive his leaving. Not emotionally. Not in the deeper sense. She had already buried too many people. She fell asleep eventually, not from peace but from exhaustion. And in the small hours of morning she woke alone in her thoughts, listening to Andrew's breathing beside her. The next day Blanche moved like a ghost through the cottage. She cleaned mechanically. She folded linen. She prepared supplies Andrew would need for the evacuation. She told herself she was strong. She had always been strong. But strength was different from emptiness. In the late afternoon she went to the small drawer where she kept the few personal relics she owned. At the bottom, beneath a handkerchief and a bundle of old letters, lay a photograph, her parents. Her father in his old uniform, smiling like he didn't know how not to. Her mother beside him, head tilted, eyes full of quiet daring. They looked strange together, American soldier and French girl, an improbable love that should not have survived gossip or family disapproval. Yet in the photo, they looked unshakably happy. Blanche traced the edges of the paper with her thumb. They had chosen each other. They had chosen love over what was proper, over what was expected, over what looked safe. And Blanche realized something with sudden clarity. Since their deaths, she had survived, but she had never been safe. Not truly. Until Andrew. Andrew had made her feel at home. Not in a country, not in a village, but in her own skin. In the quiet warmth of being loved without conditions. A life without that, without him, suddenly seemed not noble, but bleak. She sat there a long time, breathing slowly, until her decision formed with the same steady certainty she used for resistance work. When she returned to the bedroom, Andrew was sitting on the edge of the bed, boots on, face drawn. He looked up as she entered, hope already dead in his eyes. Blanche crossed to him and placed the photograph gently in his hands. He frowned, confused. "My parents," she said. Andrew looked down at the image, then up at her. Blanche's voice shook slightly, but she did not look away. They chose each other, she whispered. Even when it was complicated. Even when it made no sense to the world. Andrew's breath caught. Blanche swallowed, forcing the words out before fear could strangle them. I said leaving would be cowardice, she continued. And perhaps it is. But perhaps courage can look like something else, too. Andrew stared at her, silent. Blanche reached down and took his hand. You made me feel safe, she said quietly. You made me feel home. Andrew's eyes filled, though he blinked it away with stubbornness. Blanche tightened her grip. Yes, she said. I'll go with you. To England. For a moment Andrew didn't move at all, as if the sentence had broken him. Then he stood awkwardly, painfully, and pulled her into his arms. Blanche held him fiercely, burying her face against his shoulder. Andrew's voice was barely audible. You won't regret it, he whispered. Blanche closed her eyes, feeling the strange mix of fear and relief rush through her like a tide. I already know I won't, she replied. And as the cottage held them in its dim, fragile safety for what might be their final days in France, Blanche understood that the war had taken almost everything from her. But it had not taken her right to choose love. The summer of 1944 carried a kind of brightness that felt almost unfamiliar. England was still under wartime discipline, rationing, uniforms, blackout habits that lingered even when daylight was generous, but something in the air had shifted. The news was different now. The radio voices sounded less grim, the newspapers less careful with hope. Paris had been liberated. Blanche did not need anyone to tell her what that meant. She felt it in her body first. A sudden tightness in her chest, followed by a strange lightness, as if something long held down had finally been allowed to rise. That morning she made sure everything was in place. Marie wore her best dress, blue with a white collar, her hair brushed into obedient curls that lasted only minutes before she began to wriggle and protest. Blanche herself dressed simply but well, never too French, never too defiant, but always unmistakably herself. By now she understood the quiet rules of British society, how much to reveal, what to soften, when to let people grow used to her presence instead of forcing them to accept it. She had learned, at cost, how to stand beside Andrew in his new world without shrinking. And today, of all days, she would not be absent. The RAF building was busy with motion, men going in and out of offices, messengers carrying files, telephones ringing with a nervous energy that felt close to joy. Blanche moved through it calmly, as if she belonged there because she did. She had earned it. Not through charm, but through constancy. She waited with Marie in Andrew's office, the child on her lap, small hands playing with the buttons of Blanche's sleeve. Outside, aircraft engines sounded in the distance, familiar now, part of the landscape of their life. When the door finally opened, Andrew stepped in. He looked different than he had when Blanche first met him. The war had hardened him, yes, but it had also made him steadier, less reckless, less haunted by the need to prove himself. His uniform was immaculate, his posture composed, and the insignia on his collar spoke of promotions earned quickly and unmistakably. He closed the door behind him, and for a brief moment he allowed his face to soften. His eyes went straight to them. "Papa!" Marie cried, launching herself off Blanche's lap and running with unrestrained certainty. Andrew laughed, an unguarded sound that Blanche still found almost miraculous, and opened his arms. Marie collided with him, clinging around his neck. Andrew lifted her effortlessly, pressing his cheek to her hair as if collecting himself through her small warm weight. Then he looked at Blanche. His gaze held something deeper than happiness, relief, gratitude, love disciplined by years of fear. Blanche rose. Andrew crossed the room without hesitation, his hand finding her waist, drawing her close. For a second she allowed herself to rest against him, breathing him in clean wool, faint tobacco, the familiar warmth of the only man who had ever made her feel truly safe after her parents died. "Of course you're here," he murmured, as if the thought of her being elsewhere had never existed. Blanche's mouth twitched into a smile. "Where else would I be today?" Andrew kissed her temple gently. Marie giggled between them, delighted to be the center of the world. They remained like that a moment, the three of them held together in a circle the war could not penetrate, not completely, not today. Blanche watched Andrew as he set Marie down and removed his gloves, the careful movements of a man trained to control everything. Yet his eyes kept returning to her, as if making sure she was real. She understood why. For Andrew, she was not only love. She was proof. The months hidden in that cottage in Picardy had been his first experience of a life that wasn't performance. He had once imagined honor would come from medals and perfect family expectations. Instead it had come from bread, whispered conversations, bandages, fear shared. From Blanche. Now, years later, they had built a different world, small, resilient. A daughter. A home. A marriage that had survived not only scrutiny and prejudice, but the constant knowledge that their story began in a house where discovery meant death. Blanche had conquered her place in Britain slowly. She had been tolerated first, then accepted, then, by some, quietly admired. Her English was flawless now, though her accent remained as a stubborn mark of origin. Andrew's family had learned that Blanche was not a novelty, not a mistake, not a romantic impulsiveness. She was permanence. And she did not regret her choice. Not for a second. Still, that morning, Paris stirred something old in her. When Marie wandered to the window, distracted by a plane overhead, Blanche stepped closer to Andrew and lowered her voice. "Paris is free," she said softly. Andrew nodded, his eyes darkening with emotion. "I know." Blanche swallowed. "When this ends, I want to go back." Andrew didn't flinch. He didn't mistake her meaning. "Home," he said quietly. "Yes," Blanche replied, and the word carried everything. Her parents, her village, the café, the occupation, the names she still carried like scars. Andrew took her hands between his. "Then, we'll go together. All of us." He glanced toward Marie, then back at Blanche. "When the war is finished, we'll travel. Properly. Safely. We'll take her to see Paris in peace. To see the Seine without soldiers. To see France without fear." Blanche's throat tightened. She nodded once, unable to speak for a moment. Andrew continued, calmer now, already planning. "We'll arrange it through channels. I'll get leave as soon as it's possible. We'll go when it's right, not reckless, not in pieces. Together." Blanche felt tears threaten, quiet ones, not of sadness, but of something like release. She leaned in and kissed him, slow and steady. When she pulled back, she rested her forehead against his. For the first time, she whispered, "I can imagine a future without running." Andrew's hand tightened around hers. "Then we'll build it," he said. "In England. In France. Wherever you need it to be." Outside, summer light spilled over London as if the world were trying to remember how to be gentle. Inside that office, with their daughter humming softly at the window and Andrew's fingers warm around hers, Blanche understood that liberation was not only something that happened to cities. Sometimes, it happened to people. And this time, she would return to France not as a girl carrying secrets in her pocket, but as a woman who had survived, who had chosen love without surrendering honor, and who was finally going home with her family beside her.
Thank you for listening to this story. If it stayed with you, you are warmly invited to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. New timeless love stories await you. Until next time.